Hello and welcome. This is the third episode of our new webinar series, The Story of Rivers. We, the South East Rivers Trust, are a grassroots environmental charity working to bring rivers and their catchments back to life. Our webinars, The Story of Rivers, will share with you what makes our rivers special, why we need them, how they work, and the threats and pressures that they are facing, as well as sharing the most important part, what we are doing to try and help them. All of our webinars will be posted on our Facebook group, the Sur River Club, along with many other activities. Before we begin, let me introduce your presenters today. Myself, I am Polly Penn and have worked for the Trust for 5 years and are now leading the engagement and education team.
I'm Bella Davis and I'm the Trust Director of the South East Rivers Trust.
I'm Cathy. I've worked at the Trust for about 1.5 years now, and I mainly focus on water resources and how we manage our landscapes to protect and restore them.
So this episode, we're going to try and answer the question, what do healthy rivers do for us? From webinar 1, you'll remember that we now know the elements and processes that you find in a healthy river. And today, we're going to look at why we need them to stay healthy. And this involves understanding and exploring ecosystem services. We will then finish hearing from our Trust Director, Bella, about what CERT is doing to improve the health of rivers for both people and wildlife. As always, if you'd like to ask a question at any point or afterwards, please post them in the comment section below. This will help guide future webinars, but we also might organise some question and answer sessions if there's particular topics that everyone is interested in. But for now, I'll hand over to Cathy to explain ecosystem services.
Thanks, Polly. So as we said, the question we're trying to answer today is, what do healthy rivers do for us? And obviously, when we talk about healthy rivers, we don't just talk about the channel itself, we also talk about the catchments around them. So we've mentioned that a few times in the past, but it's important to remember that the landscapes around the river are part of the whole ecosystem as well. So there's loads to talk about in this webinar because healthy rivers obviously do so much for individuals and society as a whole. And we probably can think of some of those ways a little bit easier than we can of others, but all of the different elements that this ecosystem is made from, so all the floodplains, the wetlands, the ponds, etc., that make up this whole river ecosystem and the catchment around it, have lots of different functions and different processes that go on in it, and those are all quite important for the health of that ecosystem functioning itself, but also important for our well-being. And while some of that is more obvious than others, all of them are important and we benefit from them in some way or another, and we call those benefits that we get from nature ecosystem services. So it might seem a little bit odd to talk about nature as a service provider, but that's really just a concept that makes it really obvious for us to understand how we depend on this complex net of ecosystems around us, and how we need that to be able to survive, and how rivers are a key part of that is what we'll discuss today. And just to help us understand all the different ways that we can benefit from nature, we tend to split that into 4 different categories of services that nature provides us with. So we think about supporting services, for example, which are those functions and processes that everything else builds on. So for example, biodiversity is an underlying supporting service, and so is photosynthesis, for example. Without photosynthesis, we wouldn't have any oxygen to breathe. So clearly that's quite an important way that nature supports us. Provisioning services are a little bit easier. Those are the services that we can actively use and that help us produce things like, for example, water, but also the ability to navigate, food, or the energy to use for hydropower. Regulating services are a little bit trickier, but as the name suggests, they are processes that kind of regulate how things function in the environment. So for example, climate regulation by adjusting different temperatures over land and in the air, or water flows. And last but not least, cultural ecosystem services. Those describe the way that we benefit from nature by interacting with it, really. So it's things like being able to go for a walk and how that makes us feel better, or even the inspiration that we get from nature when you look at pieces of art, for example. Or, and I've actually just realized I've got a really nice example of a bit of cultural ecosystem services in the background, where our landscapes and nature has always been something that's inspired people to create something. So that's a really important thing that we shouldn't forget as a way that we benefit from healthy rivers as well. But let's start with one of the sort of maybe most obvious services, clean and plentiful water. So the very first important thing that rivers and their interconnected groundwater systems especially provide us with is water. All the water that is in our taps has come from a river, a lake, or a groundwater body not that long ago. And in southeast England, it's actually quite a high proportion of that water that comes from groundwater. And that groundwater often also feeds our chalk streams that we've already spoken about a little bit. The reason that so much of that water comes from chalk groundwater bodies is because that water is very clean. It requires very little treatment for us to be able to drink it. And a similar sort of thing happens in rivers and wetlands, where plants and other organisms take up excess nutrients, for example, so polluting substances, so they clean water, and soils can also help filter water and so provide us with cleaner water than we might otherwise have. In terms of how much of that is actually being provided in southeast England, per day we use an average of 5 billion litres of water. I don't know whether anyone can actually imagine how much that is, so I thought I'd come up with two ways of picturing that. And one is, if you think of 5 billion litres of water, that's about the amount of water that flows through the Thames at Kingston per day. So we've got a photo of that. So if you stood there for 24 hours, you would approximately see the amount of water flow past you that we use every day just in the southeast. Or to use a more traditional unit of measurement, it's equivalent to about 2,000 Olympic swimming pools full of water. That's per day, and actually in a hot day we tend to use even more than that. So where does all that water actually get used? On average in England we use 143 litres of water per day per person. So that's not just the water that we drink, that's showering, brushing our teeth, cleaning our clothes, cooking, washing the car, washing the garden, etc., etc. So if you just think of having a 5-minute shower in the morning, brushing your teeth twice a day, flushing the toilets and washing your hands like 3 times, although please wash them more often at the moment. But then you're already at over 100 litres and you haven't even made a cup of tea yet. So we've said that before, and we'll say it again. The southeast of England is designated as seriously water stressed, so that means the current and future demand for water makes up a significantly higher proportion of the water that is available for our use. So we need to be really careful about the balance between us using this water that we obviously need to meet our demands, but the water that is left in the environment for rivers and the wildlife that lives in them. So that's a really tight balancing act, and it's important that we all do things at home that help us save water wherever possible, because it is a really precious resource, and the less we use, the more water is left in the landscape, and our rivers don't dry out so often, as you can see on the picture that we've got here of the Hogsmill.
Thanks, Catty. So I'm going to talk about how rivers have helped transport and industry. So it's no coincidence that the major cities around the world are situated around a body of water. And that's because the importance of water historically to move goods and people is one of the reasons that civilization started living close to rivers thousands of years ago. So that was back before we had roads and rail infrastructure, and river transport was the quickest way to transport goods and people. And this applied locally as well. So in Kent, where we had, back in the day when we had limited and poor road systems, the River Medway was used to transport goods around the country instead. Despite railways, aeroplanes and better roads, river transport is still a key part of industry today. So just some stats for you, because everyone loves stats. In 2018, the total volume of goods transported on European inland waterways was 544 million tonnes. So that's a lot. And if we look more closely to home, the River Medway is still used regularly for the transportation of goods. And the Medway ports in 2018, which includes Chatham Docks and Sheerness, were ranked 11th out of 30 busiest UK major ports. So that just shows that rivers are still providing that service to us today. And we didn't only use rivers to move goods, we also used them to create them. So historically, the power of rivers in the southeast and across the globe was harnessed to operate mills, creating a variety of goods from gunpowder to paper, textiles, dyes, metals, and more. Some examples locally are the River Wandle, which was infamous for being one of the hardest worked rivers in Europe for its length, with 90 mills recorded at one time along its 20-kilometre length. So that's quite a small river, but generating a lot of power and a lot of industry in South London. The River Medway was also heavily associated with the milling industry, and it would be safe to say that any river in the southeast probably had milling in its past at one time or another.
Rivers are cool. Really, they cool down temperatures at a local scale, so that's called local climate regulation, and it's one of the ecosystem services that we've already mentioned. So at local scales, without even having to get into the river, rivers can regulate the temperatures around us. So if you think back to the first webinar that we had, we mentioned evaporation and transpiration and how that is part of the water cycle. And that's a really important function for us too. In hot weather periods, water bodies can take up a lot of that heat around them, and the evaporation that then occurs cools down some of that air around them. So for example, the River Thames can have something like 0.6 degree cooler air around it than areas further away from it, and you can see that on the map on the screen. So that's a temperature map of London, and you can really see how the Thames has a slightly cooling function. And that's obviously especially important in hot days, and 0.6 degrees difference might not sound like that much, but on a really hot day that can make quite a difference to how comfortable we feel. That cooling effect of flowing water is greater than of water that is standing still, and that's because better mixing of flowing water and air happens than a standing water body. And so big river bodies are also important in, for example, wine production in that sense, in that they not only cool down temperatures in the summer, they can also keep temperatures a little bit higher in the winter and provide a little bit of that buffering function. So if you think about wine producing regions of Europe, for example, a lot of them will be along river valleys. And then that's another really interesting way, maybe not quite as essential as the sort of cooling down our environment just for us to live in, but still enjoyable.
A natural landscape has many different habitats that help regulate extreme flow events, both high and low. So if you think outside of a river into the wider catchment, a natural landscape would have many different other freshwater habitats like ponds or wetlands, and these all provide additional water storage. So in high rain, these help slow the river's response to high rain by holding back water in the landscape and consequently holding back the flood peak. And they also help retain water higher up in the landscape during drier times as well. Within a river itself, there are also features that provide a regulating ecosystem service of holding back high flows. For example, natural wood in rivers act like mini dams and help to slow the flood peak downstream. And a natural meandering river would hold more water than a straight one. So that's another example of how the habitat is a regulating service. And finally, floodplains are an obvious one, but often forgotten. So natural floodplains are areas where the river would naturally break its banks and store water in high flows, reducing the speed and volume of water that travels downstream. And when they are disconnected, for example, the river's been embanked, all of that water instead stays in the channel and is pushed faster downstream, losing that regulating function.
So beauty and heritage are two other ways that we benefit from our rivers. So they are part of the cultural ecosystem services that we mentioned, and then there's something that we should really not forget, because there's such a big way in which we've always kind of benefited from our landscapes. So rivers not only, like Polly's already said, allow us to, or have allowed us in the past to use our landscape in a different way and to transport goods up and down and help us sort of settle in places that have that connect us to to the wider world around us. But they also have shaped that sense of place. So for example, lots of place names today still reflect that. So Oxford, for example, is the place where oxen could cross the river. Dartford is where Romans built a road to ford the River Darrand. Or Tunbridge has been shortened from a town of bridges because of the large number of streams that the high street would have crossed. Lots of springs have been marked by highly decorated grottos that would sort of denote the source of a particular river, especially with chalk streams. So, for example, the lower photo here shows the grotto in Carshalton where the River Wandle starts, or where the perennial head of the Wandle starts, rather. So that's a really decorated place, and we find a lot of those that mark those sorts of springs. So they're almost like a place of worship, like you would find in different faiths as well. So just denoting that people have always found those places to be really inspiring and important to them. And on the top photo, you can see another place that people find inspiring and important, and that tends to be located near rivers where possible, which is the amount of pubs that we find near or on rivers, which give us an idea of how much people enjoy sitting on or by water. There's also countless poems, stories and folklore about rivers that show how important they are in our cultural understanding. So for example, we've picked out The Riverbank by Aaron Bollins here that you can read, which is a lovely poem about why we like rivers so much, but also the stories that we've had about Father Thames, which is the sort of personification of the Thames in its human form. And the tales of Father Thames are a great example of this, with the tributaries of the Thames manifesting himself as his sons in the stories. And that also reflects the way that we've treated the environment or that we've perceived it over time. So in the 19th century, for example, those stories told us about how Father Thames's sons, Tyburn, Fleet and Effra, died as a result of the pollution in the Thames and the environmental destruction of the rivers by the city's inhabitants. And Father Thames then angrily left the city of London and the tidal areas and moved upstream into the Thames Valley, nearer to the source of the river, where he's remained till present day. And that was as a sort of result of the Great Stink, which is another great story about environmental destruction that we should tell sometime. And Polly can pick up on the more active ways that we can enjoy those services.
So yeah, the other cultural service that we enjoy is through leisure and amenity. So the benefits of spending time near water on your mental health and physical health are well documented. And perhaps that's why so many of us choose to spend our leisure time walking around rivers, streams, lakes, walking, canoeing, kayaking, fishing, and all sorts. A good example of just the value we put behind this activity is that UK anglers alone spent 20 million combined days fishing each year. And that puts a whopping £1.46 billion into the English economy every year. And if you think about angling as an informal recreation activity, it can help build resilience for your ill health through opportunities of relaxation, relief from stress, improved physical activity, and again, being out there in natural environments. So the benefits of that can't be underestimated.
So the last thing that's sort of left for us to talk about is the supporting services that we haven't really mentioned yet. And biodiversity is obviously a key part of how our ecosystems function. So it's obvious how ecosystems are key to providing us with a lot of how our well-being functions, or where we get our well-being from, and the different functions that support soil formation or primary production, like that oxygen production, nutrient recycling, etc. And so we need this whole system to function well, and biodiversity is a key part of that. If you think, for example, of an ecosystem as a careful balance and exchange of materials and energy, if you take one element of that out of it, that can potentially lose functionality of the whole system. And biodiversity is almost like an insurance mechanism for that, where we've got lots of different elements in our ecosystems that can take up lots of different functions and are good at different bits of this, of how this whole system works. And so they can take over other functions if one of them sort of gets out of balance. And we need all of these so that we always have that ability to be balanced. So we need a high number of species and a high variety of species. And studies have shown that when biodiversity declines, that can have really dramatic effects on the way that we receive those benefits from nature and the way that ecosystems are able to provide us with those benefits. And we're experiencing a biodiversity crisis at the moment. So we talk a lot about climate change, but we also talk a lot about biodiversity loss. And it's really important to remember that. So recent estimates suggest, for example, that extinction threatens up to 1 million species of plants and animals, and in large part that is due to human activities like deforestation, hunting or overfishing. Other serious threats include invasive species, diseases from human trade, as well as population and human-caused climate change. And a lot of that we've talked about previously. But it's really important that we need all of these, and we need that balance, because if species go extinct more quickly, then they can naturally evolve to fill that gap in the system. Then we are potentially in a really we've got a big problem about how we can continue balancing this. So that the balance of benefits and systems is something that we've kind of touched on quite a lot now. So some of the benefits from nature have always been a lot easier to find and understand and exploit for us than others, and that's where a lot of these problems that we find ourselves in now in terms of environmental degradation come from. That we've always been really ingenious at managing our environment so that it can provide us with what we think we need. So just think of, for example, how humans invented agriculture and just were able at some point to manage an ecosystem so that it would provide them with all the food that they needed. But that can lead us to change our environment in a way that it becomes less able to do all the other things that we needed to do. So often when we maximize the outputs from one type of service, that has an effect on how well all the other services can be provided and all the other benefits that we get from it. So we might get a lot more from one thing, but overall we actually end up with less. So think, for example, back to the amount of water that we use every day. And imagine what would happen if we actually took all of this water out of the Thames in every day. So obviously that's not how it works at the moment, but imagine if we abstracted all this water that we need every single day from the Thames and nothing was left in it to go further downstream. We couldn't do any of the navigation, we wouldn't have any biodiversity in it, we would lose that heat, that cooling effect that the Thames provides at the moment. So just as an example of what would happen if we really focus on just having one thing. So we need to take care of how we balance what we get from nature and how we want it to function, not just for the environment's sake, but also really for our own sake.
So our webinar series so far has explained the basic functioning of a river catchment. We've showcased some of the wonderful types of river that we have, and we've outlined what healthy rivers do for us. But sadly, some rivers are not healthy and they've been degraded by various human activity over the years. And so the benefits that they provide us with are at risk. And that's where we come in as an organisation. So we are the South East Rivers Trust. We're a grassroots charity working to bring rivers and their catchments back to life across the southeast of England. And while some of you may know us well, some of you may not, we may be new to you. So I'm going to introduce who we are and what we do here at the South East Rivers Trust. So first, a little history. Well, while we are now the South East Rivers Trust, we actually started out as a smaller charity in South London on the River Wandle. And in the late 1990s, a local group of residents and anglers were concerned for the state of the river, and they got together and they began to pull rubbish out, and they also developed a project with school children to put trout back in the river because they were once a very iconic species in the Wandle, but they'd all died out from pollution. And this group then formed a charity, and over the years they started delivering a wider range of work, including river restoration. And then in 2007, two transformational things happened. Firstly, we joined the Rivers Trust movement, which meant that we're part of a wider network of Rivers Trusts across the country, all doing similar work. And secondly, there was a massive pollution incident where bleach was accidentally released from Beddington sewage treatment works during a cleaning process, and it bleached 5 kilometres of the river, killing over 2 tons of fish. That was well over 10,000 fish. And this was important not just because it was a very sad moment for the Wandle, but it also surprised everyone as to just what had been living in the river. And all of that process and the reaction from everybody as well led to Thames Water pledging £500,000 to the recovery of the river. And some of that money came to the Wandle Trust, and that allowed the Trust to recruit their first member of staff in 2009, and that was me. And it wasn't long before the work that we were doing, we started to be asked to do that similar work on other rivers where they had no coordinated group looking after it. And so we raised the funds to do that. And then in 2013, we changed our name to the South East Rivers Trust to reflect our wider geography, because it wasn't appropriate that we were just called the Wandle Trust anymore. And since then, we've expanded our coverage and our area of benefit further to a number of other river catchments where there was no Rivers Trust body present. And this has allowed us to start projects on new rivers across 12 river catchments. So this is where we work now, and some of the main river systems in our area. So from the Wandle that you can see there roughly in the middle of the map, where we originated, we now cover these 12 river systems from the Loddon in the west, right through to the River Stour in Kent, which is our most easterly catchment. And the boundary, or the shape of the area that we cover, is like it is because adjacent to us there are other rivers trusts, which are separate organisations, and they're working there covering different river systems. And the activities that we undertake in each river catchment vary. For example, in some we have really comprehensive volunteering programmes, while in others we work more with other people, other partners who do similar work, and we support them. So as the South East Rivers Trust, our vision is to achieve healthy river ecosystems for all across the southeast of England. And our mission is to deliver outstanding river ecosystem enhancement through science-based action, collaboration, education, and engagement. And so how we achieve our mission? Well, we do this in 4 main ways. Firstly, by engaging communities and stakeholders with rivers and their catchment areas. Secondly, by educating children and adults about the value of a healthy river, what that looks like and how we might achieve it. That engaging and educating part is key to achieving our vision of healthy rivers for all. As Sir David Attenborough has said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. So we can't expect people to care about rivers if they've never experienced them. And so it's vital that we encourage everyone to discover their local river and to understand a bit about it and how special it is, and to be aware of the pressures that are facing their rivers today. And so we try to empower everyone to be part of the solution, helping to improve rivers and reduce the pressures on them so that they have a brighter future. And this is why engagement and education play a pivotal role in everything that we do. So the third thing we do is actual river ecosystem enhancements on the ground. And we have an in-house team which over the years have delivered a wide variety of projects to help restore natural processes back to rivers. And this can be from removing weirs which interrupt the flow of water, or putting fish ladders on the weirs that can't be removed, to removing concrete and naturalising habitat, or creating wetlands, which are an important part of the watery mosaic of habitats, and they can clean up contaminated water that's coming into rivers. Through to natural flood management, which we do really at the top of the catchment, and it slows the flow of rainwater falling on the very top of the catchment. That helps reduce flooding downstream. And finally, we work wherever we work and whatever we do it in partnership with others, as together we can achieve more. And one of the important ways that we do this is by running a number of catchment partnerships, where we pull together different organisations with an interest in a river or who might have an influence on it. And together we pool our data to understand what's going on with the river. We look at the pressures on it and how each of our organisations might help to deliver solutions to reduce and resolve those pressures. And here we work in partnership with a wide range of organisations such as the Environment Agency, water companies, farming groups, wildlife trusts and local countryside and conservation groups. So now you know a little bit more about us. The next webinars will look at the issues facing rivers in more detail and what we're going to do to address them.
And that's the end of our webinar. So as always, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or previous topics, then please let us know, because we'd be happy to answer them or perhaps provide a question and answer session. Next time on The Story of Rivers, we'll be hosted by Toby and Nick from our resident delivery team, and they're going to be talking about the work they do to restore natural processes in rivers across the southeast. So I think that's one that a lot of people will be looking forward to. But for now, I just want to say thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.